Media in Society. This is Media Economics Part 3. Last time we were talking about the media industrial complex. One media researcher by the name of Ben Bagdikian was worried about this consolidation, this coming together of that complex. He was anxious that media are becoming more centralized, that a few corporations control most media. And he spent a large part of his career arguing that this centralization is dangerous over time. Let's look at some numbers. By the late 1980s, 25,000 media outlets were existent in the United States. A vast majority of them were owned by 50 corporations. Now, by 2004, this chart, produced by the Media Reform Information Center, it indicates that by 2004, we were down to like 5 or 6 large corporations. Now, later on, we'll talk about the fact that it's a bit more complex than that at the moment. But the bottom line, a lot of media are controlled by a relatively small number of corporations. Now, I'll come back to this graphic in a little while, but first I want to point out that Bagdikian, the media researcher, also worried that what happens with such media consolidation is commonly covered as horse race reporting. Remember that term. Just the idea of reporting on who's rising, who's falling, but really no backstory, no social consequence sort of reporting, and that's what we'll kind of talk about in these remaining lectures, the consequences of this for our society. Often television and newspapers and radio, more and more we were seeing them occurring under the same roof. And therefore they're not really competing with one another the way they used to, and the watchdog is gone. Media concentration from there continues. But still, though, just to play the devil's advocate on the other side, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with consolidation? As discussed earlier, we live in this capitalistic society, and there could be some big benefits to consolidating under one roof, big cost savings that can be then passed along to us, to the consumers. But Bagdikian worried that we are hampering the free exchange of information, and that jeopardizes our free democratic society, and that democratic society won't be able to function properly, fairly, or justly. Bagdikian wrote, back when 50 corporations owned most media in this country, remember that one, quote, "Far more effective in creating public opinion is the pursuit of events or ideas until they are displayed in depth over a period of time, until they form a coherent picture and become integrated into public thinking. It is this continuous repetition and emphasis that create high priorities among the general public and in government. It is in that power to treat some subjects briefly and obscurely, but others repetitively and in depth, or to take initiatives unrelated to external events, that ownership interests most effectively influence the news they create," end quote. But it's about more than just being told who to vote for, I think Bagdikian was arguing, or whether or not to back various governmental initiatives. Critics worry that this homogenization can have a degrading effect on our society. And I want you to hear from a colleague of mine, Wendy Radal, who I studied with at the University of Colorado. She's a media studies scholar from UC, who tells us, or I should say CU is the way I like to say it, who tells us it's all about a loss of the potential for diverse views in the media, just for its own sake, that it's just going to be this kind of watering down. Let's take a listen.
So I think the biggest threat to media consolidation in my mind is to that wider democratic process. But I also think that there's a problem in that we as an audience deserve a rich array of cultural choices when it comes to our entertainment too. And as competition ramps up, as the profit levels become ever greater, the amount of money at stake is ever greater, there's a tendency for these large companies to go more with, well, what's going to be the safe bet? What movie are we going to choose to produce that we know is going to be a sure thing? It may be just a lame sequel, a formulaic knockoff of something else that was a hit in Hollywood, but something that doesn't involve big box office actors or a riskier topic. The chances that we're going to get to see those kinds of things are in danger. And especially if we just take the example of film, the problem there too is that not only the production tends to be oriented toward things that they regard as safe, formulaic kinds of productions, but the distribution channels also are owned by the major producers who are then in turn under the umbrella of these huge corporations, and that makes it difficult if you're an independent film producer and you do want to do something that's riskier or outside the mainstream. If you can't get it distributed, it doesn't matter whether you can make the movie or not. If those distribution channels are owned by this small number of large companies, it further constricts the ability to get alternative messages out there, and I think that's a problem.
Now I want to return for a moment to that graph on media consolidation. Not too long ago, I'd be using this graph and other more up-to-date versions perhaps as good representations of the media ownership landscape today. I'd be pointing out that a small number of massive companies would want to achieve what's called vertical integration. Now later I'll explain how the handful of companies thought to control everything. That's all changing. I'll get to that. But first, this idea of vertical integration really has not changed. Corporations are jockeying for control today, and they all want that. They all want vertical integration. Let me explain. None of the biggest media companies want to dominate a single medium. You have to understand that. For example, you'll never have one company owning all of the film production studios. Instead, the strategy has been something more like this. Just a little bit of a graphic that I made for you. The companies want to own as many different forms of media as possible. So in other words, one corporation might want to have movie studios. But not all of them, but some of them, and some powerful ones. They might want to also own magazines and television and radio. And also they might want to own some companies involved with book publishing, online content creation, and other things, like sports teams, theme parks, and more. Not all companies go this deep, but you get the idea. They want to have more than just one sort of media. So once these corporations have some vertical integration, as we see here, then they can push their products and services on a variety of platforms, and in a sense they have complete control of the message. They call this synergy. It's the name of the game in media economics. I'll give you some examples of synergy at the start of next lecture. This ends Media Economics Part 3.